In the spring of 1873, the quiet town of Bingen am Rhein in western Germany became the reluctant host to a mystery that would captivate both scientific minds and spiritual seekers across Europe. It centered on a 14-year-old girl named Emma Richter, whose body began to exhibit terrifying and unexplainable symptoms without any warning or apparent cause. The first recorded incident came during a routine Sunday church service, where Emma suddenly screamed and collapsed to the ground. Her arms and face were marked by what appeared to be fresh burns, red, inflamed, and in some places blistering. There had been no contact with fire, steam, or any chemicals that could account for it. She had been sitting calmly with her family, her hands folded in prayer just moments before the pain erupted. The local physician, Dr. Matthias Engel, initially assumed some form of contact dermatitis or allergic reaction, but as days turned to weeks, Emma's symptoms did not follow any known medical pattern. At times, her skin seemed to react to nothing, at all erupting into welts, forming strange patterns of raised, heated flesh, or flaking as if sun-scorched, even in the absence of sunlight. She would sometimes wake in the morning to find new wounds on her legs and back, as if inflicted during sleep, though there was no sign of trauma to her bed or linens. The case was passed from local doctors to more prominent physicians in nearby Mainz, and later to specialists in Frankfurt. Each visit yielded the same result: no cause, no diagnosis, no cure. Emma was not feverish. Her blood work, as far as it could be tested at the time, showed no signs of infection or imbalance. There was no indication of epilepsy or hysteria, the two favored catch-all diagnoses of that era for unusual female behavior. But Emma's behavior was not unusual. She remained lucid, polite, and intelligent throughout her affliction. She was aware of the strangeness of her condition and cooperated fully with her examinations, often apologizing for the inconvenience she believed she was causing others. It was this calm demeanor, juxtaposed with her increasingly dramatic symptoms, that troubled the doctors most. On several occasions, Emma was subjected to controlled observation under clinical conditions. She was kept under watch for full 48-hour periods with no contact from anyone but medical staff. Despite this, new marks and burns continued to appear, sometimes in symmetrical patterns across her body, sometimes as single isolated lesions. On one occasion, a nurse recorded witnessing a red welt slowly rise across Emma's forearm as if drawn by an invisible stylus, leaving behind skin so hot to the touch it steamed in the cold winter air. Photographs were taken and presented at a symposium in Vienna that summer, where Emma's case was discussed as an example of psychosomatic manifestation. No one could quite explain how a psychological condition could produce heat-based injuries. As word of Emma's condition spread, the public imagination seized upon her story. Spiritualist newspapers dubbed her the Burning Girl and speculated about divine possession, karmic punishment, or latent telekinetic abilities. Others wondered if her condition was tied to the sins of her ancestors, invoking medieval notions of inherited guilt. But for the medical community, Emma represented something deeply unsettling, a failure of their understanding, a challenge to their authority. One physician, Dr. Leopold Keisler, who traveled from Prague to observe Emma, wrote in his notes that the child defies nature and perhaps defines a new one. Keisler attempted to apply experimental salves and herbal compresses, only to witness Emma's skin reject the remedies violently, erupting into more severe inflammation. Emma's family, ordinary people of modest means, bore the brunt of the social reaction. Rumors circulated that they had made a pact with dark forces or were punishing their daughter in secret, despite all evidence to the contrary. Local clergy performed blessings and exorcisms, none of which alleviated Emma's suffering. At times, she would fall into deep trances, during which her breathing would slow to nearly imperceptible levels and her skin temperature would drop dramatically. Then, hours later, she would awaken with burn marks or blistering once again forming along her neck or spine. One of the most disturbing observations was the frequency with which the burns, aligned with religious iconography, cross-shaped scars, stigmata-like wounds on her palms, or arcs along her shoulders resembling wings. This further fueled speculation that Emma was not merely ill, but marked. A group of French scientists attempted to test the hypothesis of fraud. suggesting that Emma might be secretly harming herself or being harmed by someone in the household. They embedded tiny grains of chalk in the bandages they applied, hoping to detect tampering, and applied soft wax coatings to her skin to look for contact marks. None of their traps were triggered, and yet the injuries continued. Emma herself expressed frustration with the tests, not out of fear, but sadness that no one believed she wanted to be healed. Her diary, preserved in part by her younger sister, contains entries that blend sorrow and confusion. "Why do they look at me like I am a puzzle? I hurt, and still they stare like I am a ghost," she wrote in June 1873. Even more curious was the fact that Emma seemed to experience sensations in reverse. She often reported feeling pain before the physical injury appeared, as if her nervous system anticipated the trauma. During one experiment involving light exposure, Emma reported searing pain moments before her skin began to redden in the absence of any UV source. Her reflexes were otherwise normal, and her mental faculties were entirely intact, which led some physicians to posit that perhaps her body was responding to internal changes. It's invisible to the human eye or beyond the technology of the time. Microscopy revealed nothing anomalous in skin samples, save for slightly elevated levels of histamine, which could be attributed to general inflammation, but did not explain the heat or patterns of injury. As the summer gave way to autumn, Emma's condition deteriorated. The burns became deeper, her body frailer. But there was no infection, no fever, no sepsis, just a slow, consistent degradation of the skin and soft tissue. She continued to walk, speak, and even write letters during this time. Observers noted her serene composure, despite her visible pain. She became something of a pilgrimage site for the curious and the faithful. People lined the road to the Richter household, hoping to catch a glimpse of the girl science could not explain. Some left with relic scraps of her handkerchiefs, small, pressed flowers she had touched, believing her to be touched by divinity or some higher cosmic force. Priests and skeptics alike left without answers, their convictions shaken or reinforced in strange new ways. Emma, meanwhile, endured each day with quiet grace, her mystery deepening as physicians grew increasingly desperate for a rational explanation. Her body was a canvas of burns that no fire had touched. It, a living contradiction to the natural laws her doctors thought immutable. Doctors across Europe found themselves both fascinated and frustrated by the enigma that was Emma Richter. As her story reached the desks of medical academies and universities, letters of inquiry began flooding into Bingen. Local physicians, overwhelmed by the attention and unable to provide a definitive diagnosis, welcomed the involvement of more experienced practitioners. What began as a provincial curiosity quickly transformed into a pan-European case study. Drawing in some of the most respected names in 19th century medicine, Dr. Gustav Maurer, an esteemed internist from Berlin, was among the first to personally examine Emma after her initial symptoms became public knowledge. He arrived with skepticism, believing her case to be a manifestation of hysteria or an elaborate ruse. But upon witnessing her symptoms firsthand under strictly controlled conditions, his tone shifted dramatically. In his journals, he wrote of her skin responding to invisible stimuli, describing the formation of lesions that appeared to rise in reaction to unseen forces. He administered chemical tests, exposed her to heat and cold, monitored her sleeping patterns, and applied restraints at night to ensure she wasn't inflicting harm upon herself. None of these measures halted or even slowed the appearance of fresh wounds. Following Maurer's visit, Emma was transported to the University of Heidelberg's medical facility under the supervision of Dr. Clara Hecht, one of the few female physicians practicing at the time. Hecht's approach was methodical and deeply humanistic. She kept Emma under continuous observation, documenting not only her physiological symptoms, but her emotional state, sleep cycles, and dietary responses. Hecht noted that Emma's injuries often occurred after periods of heightened emotional stress but could not link them to any specific stimuli, trauma, or environmental cause. The burns sometimes took the form of geometric patterns, and in rare cases, letters in a language no one could identify. These marks would rise like welts on her back or torso, then vanish after a day or two without leaving scars. Despite multiple attempts to document these formations through early photographic techniques, many plates came out obscured, fogged, or blank, further fueling the belief among observers that Emma's case defied not just medicine, but physics, as more specialists visited Emma, each left with a different theory, but no consistent conclusions. A Scottish doctor, Dr. Alistair Kerr, posited that Emma was suffering from a form of dermographism, a rare skin condition where light scratching can cause temporary raised marks. However, Kerr was unable to recreate the depth and severity of Emma's lesions under controlled tests. Furthermore, dermographism couldn't account for the heat that radiated from her skin, sometimes strong enough to fog glass or burn cloth. Others proposed a psychosomatic origin, citing the potential power of the subconscious to affect the body physically. Dr. Lucien Ovea Paris suggested Emma's mind had become a battlefield between belief, repression, and trauma, externalizing inner turmoil through somatic symptoms. And even he admitted this explanation was inadequate, as no known trauma or psychological pattern could induce thermal injury without an external source. Adding to the mystery was Emma's complete lack of infection. Her wounds, though often deep and raw, did not fester. In fact, they seemed to heal more quickly than typical human injuries. The absence of pus, odor, or necrosis in what should have been prime conditions for bacterial invasion mystified physicians and lent an otherworldly dimension to the case. Some began to whisper about the possibility that her body defied not only known medical logic, but the fundamental rules of biology. In response to public curiosity, several medical symposiums were held across Europe, where Emma's case was presented in detail. Slides, sketches, and written testimonies were shared, debated, and archived. Yet every time one theory gained traction, it would be countered by another equally plausible, but ultimately unprovable hypothesis. The consistency of her symptoms, spontaneous burns, patterns without explanation, heightened heat from the skin, remained steadfast across months, settings, and observers. During her stay in Heidelberg, Emma was placed in rooms with controlled temperatures, insulated walls, and no access to any known source of thermal irritation. Still, her condition persisted. Her nurses documented the emergence of fresh burns during the night, while Emma remained asleep under constant surveillance. One nurse claimed to witness a slight shimmer in the air above Emma's abdomen just moments before a red heated imprint appeared on her stomach. This claim, while unverified, was recorded in the official medical logs, adding to the growing pile of inexplicable phenomena tied to the girl's case. Reports were even sent to the British Royal Society and the French Academy of Sciences. The language in these submissions vacillated between clinical objectivity and awed bewilderment. The fact that so many reputable physicians signed off on the reality of Emma's symptoms only deepened the puzzle. These were not the notes of mystics or spiritualists, but of grounded scientists who, even in their disbelief, were forced to admit what they saw. Meanwhile, Emma herself remained composed, even cooperative, throughout the barrage of tests, pricks, restraints, and interrogations. Her willingness to submit to all procedures made it increasingly difficult for anyone to accuse her of malingering or deception. She expressed confusion about her condition, but rarely fear. Her diary entries from this period often reflected concern, not for herself, but for the discomfort she brought to others. She questioned whether her presence was a punishment or perhaps a test, and wrote of dreams in which she stood surrounded by light that burned but did not hurt. A neurologist from Prague attempted to induce her symptoms under hypnosis but failed. Emma, while deeply relaxed, did not exhibit any new marks or changes in body temperature during the sessions. The neurologist concluded that while her condition may be connected to altered states of consciousness, it was not under her volitional control. As months passed and medical explanations grew more desperate, some doctors began to step back. No longer willing to risk their reputations on what was increasingly being seen as a case without precedent or solution. The term idiopathic thermal dermopathy was coined, a label meant to acknowledge the symptoms while silently admitting the cause was unknown. But this designation was little more than a linguistic placeholder, a way for science to acknowledge its own limitations without having to delve into metaphysical or spiritual realms. Yet some did delve. A minority of physicians and researchers began to speculate openly about the possibility that Emma represented a biological anomaly tied to forces not yet understood by science. Theories ranged from electromagnetic imbalances in her nervous system to latent psychokinetic abilities. One particularly controversial paper suggested Emma might be a human focal point for geomagnetic currents, acting as a conduit through which the Earth's energies manifested physically. Most of these fringe ideas were dismissed outright, but they highlighted the sense of desperation felt by those who had spent months, even years, studying her case. By the end of the year, Emma had been seen by no fewer than 30 doctors across 5 countries. She had been subjected to every non-invasive procedure known to medicine at the time. In spite of the scrutiny, no evidence of fraud or external interference was ever found. Her symptoms had been witnessed in hospitals, homes, and laboratories. Her injuries had appeared in isolation and under watch. The burns retained their heat long enough to be measured, yet left behind skin that healed too quickly and too cleanly to be normal. No disease, mental illness, or skin condition known to 19th century medicine could fully account for what was happening to Emma Richter. Emma Richter's symptoms didn't follow any ordinary cycles, they moved in tandem with the moon. At first, this was dismissed as coincidence, but patterns soon emerged that were impossible to ignore. Local villagers, who had long paid attention to lunar cycles for farming and superstition, began whispering that Emma's body bloomed with burns as the moon waxed full. Physicians, skeptical of such claims, began charting her episodes in relation to lunar phases. Over the course of several months, it became increasingly apparent that the severity and frequency of her manifestations were peaking during full moons, and sometimes even during specific astronomical events, such as lunar eclipses. During these periods, Emma would often become restless in the evenings, reporting sensations of warmth or pressure across her skin hours before any marks appeared. Her body temperature would rise slightly, not enough to indicate fever, but just enough to be noticeable to touch. These events became so reliably tied to the lunar calendar that doctors began scheduling observation sessions around the full moon, anticipating the manifestations as if preparing for a medical performance. This pattern stirred up intense debate in the medical community. Was it possible that the human body, or at least Emma's, could be influenced by celestial rhythms? Idea was not entirely foreign. Ancient and even early modern medical traditions had long made connections between the moon and human behavior, particularly in the study of mental health. The term lunacy itself came from the belief that moon phases affected the mind. But Emma's condition wasn't mental. It was physical, visible, measurable. Her symptoms weren't metaphorical. They were burns, blisters, raised welts, skin so hot it scorched the linens she slept on. Some observers recalled the tides and the way the moon pulled the oceans. Is it so far-fetched to imagine it could influence the human body, which is composed largely of water? Others argued this was pseudoscience wrapped in poetic mysticism, a dangerous regression from empirical medicine into folklore. Regardless of the prevailing theories, Emma herself felt the pull. She wrote in her diary of a sensation she could not explain, something like a second heartbeat under her skin, fighting with the night sky. She described dreams where she floated above her body, bathed in moonlight, her skin glowing not with pain, but with something ancient, something that watched her back. These dreams intensified in the days before a full moon, often leaving her exhausted by morning and covered in fresh, hot lesions. One physician, Dr. Nikolaus Strauss, began documenting not just the physical appearance of her symptoms, but the exact time of night they formed. His notes revealed a curious consistency. Between 2 o'clock and 3:30 a.m., her body was most active. If the moon was visible in the sky, even behind clouds, Emma's symptoms were more pronounced. On nights when the moon was obscured, entirely new moons or nights of heavy overcast, her skin often remained clear. Strauss constructed experiments around these findings. including keeping Emma in underground quarters completely sealed from natural light. Even then, the symptoms followed their usual lunar rhythm. This led him to propose that her condition might be responsive to more than just visible light, perhaps to gravitational changes or other atmospheric conditions caused by the moon. Without modern instruments, this remained speculative, but the theory held sway in certain academic circles that were beginning to explore the interconnectedness of the human body and the environment. Still, many others remained deeply skeptical. Debate published in the Journal of Natural Sciences in late 1873 saw medical professionals divide sharply on the issue. Some declared Emma's case a tragic anomaly, a girl with a rare nervous disorder, timed by coincidence to the lunar calendar. Others insisted this was evidence of a more profound connection between human biology and the cosmos. One overlooked in the rush toward mechanistic understandings of health. The connection between Emma's symptoms and lunar phases caught the attention of spiritualist groups across Europe. Theosophists, mystics, and occult scholars interpreted her condition as a sign of etheric sensitivity, an ability to receive and translate cosmic energies into bodily manifestations. Emma was contacted by members of the Hermetic Order in Vienna, who requested strands of her hair and pages from her journal to use in their rituals and studies. Though her family refused to allow in-person visits from such groups, stories spread quickly that Emma was a conduit for celestial forces, perhaps chosen or cursed, depending on the beliefs of the storyteller. Her body, marked by heat and light, became a canvas for projections of faith, fear, speculation. One particularly dramatic event occurred on August 23, 1873. During a lunar perigee, when the moon was closest to the Earth, Emma had been observed calmly that day, with no symptoms for nearly 48 hours. But around 2:15 a.m., her skin erupted with red, glowing lines running down both arms, forming spirals that seemed almost deliberate in their design. A nurse in attendance attempted to cool her with damp cloth, only to find the cloth itself began to smolder faintly upon contact. The spiral markings faded by morning, but left faint outlines that persisted for nearly 2 weeks. This event, dubbed the perigee incident, was widely reported in medical and occult journals alike. For some, it was the proof that Emma was in touch with forces beyond science. For others, it was a final push to dismiss the case as too anomalous to be of clinical value, but for those close to her, the lunar connection was a source of quiet dread. Her mother reportedly covered the windows of their home with thick blankets during full moons and forbade Emma from stepping outside after sunset on such nights. They tried rituals of protection, prayers, and eventually silence, hoping to sever the link or at least diminish its strength, yet nothing changed. Whether locked in a hospital ward or resting in her own room, Emma's symptoms followed the same rhythm. The townspeople became increasingly wary. Farmers spoke of animals growing restless during the nights Emma burned. Some blamed her for failing crops or spoiled milk. A few began to speak of her not as a girl but as a vessel, something sent or opened by the sky. The line between medical mystery and myth grew thinner with each passing month. Emma herself never claimed to understand the lunar connection. She acknowledged it, felt it, and sometimes feared it, but she did not try to explain it. In one of her final known entries, she wrote that she no longer felt like her body belonged entirely to her, that there was something in the light that writes on me as though the moon were not a passive observer but an author, etching its will into her flesh. Scientists remained unable to verify or debunk the theory entirely. The instruments of the era were too crude. The understanding of electromagnetic forces too nascent. But, in the language of medicine too, rooted in physicality to accommodate what Emma's case suggested. She was neither fully embraced by the scientific world nor fully dismissed. Instead, she lingered in the margins in open question, a spectral anomaly between biology and cosmology, between faith and fact. Emma Richter, the girl whose wounds sang with the moon, stood at the precipice of what 19th century science could not yet grasp. Her body a map of unknown forces, her life bound to the waxing glow of something older and more immense than the doctors could measure or define. By the end of 1873, Emma Richter's case had become the subject of widespread fascination. not only within scientific circles, but among clergy, spiritualists, and the general public. What had begun as a provincial medical anomaly had transformed into a phenomenon that seemed to defy the boundaries between faith and science, body and spirit. As physicians failed to reach a consensus, and as new symptoms emerged without logical cause or pattern, Emma became the focus of both ecclesiastical documentation and esoteric speculation. Priests from as far as Munich and Vienna traveled to Bingen to witness her affliction, each hoping to understand whether what they were witnessing was divine, demonic, or entirely unprecedented in the annals of human suffering. Some saw in her wounds a manifestation of spiritual warfare, a physical embodiment of unseen battles waged between higher and lower realms. Her stigmata-like burns and cross-shaped scars prompted comparisons to the medieval accounts of saints and martyrs. Was not declared miraculous by the Church, but neither was she dismissed outright. Instead, she became a kind of spiritual gray area, a person whose pain mirrored sacred symbols but lacked the theological clarity for canonization or exorcism. Clergy members recorded their experiences in parish journals, some claiming to have felt a strange pressure in the air when standing near Emma, others describing an oppressive stillness during her episodes, as though the room itself paused to observe her suffering. A Benedictine abbot named Matthias Kruger described Emma as an open wound between heaven and earth, and warned that her case represented something more than illness. He performed a private rite of protection, a kind of blessing fused with older traditions, but noted in his writings that the ritual neither soothed her nor stirred the forces within. Several clergymen attempted exorcisms, some formal, others improvised, but none succeeded in halting the phenomenon. Emma remained calm during these rites, never convulsing or speaking in tongues as typically associated with possession, did not react violently to holy water or religious symbols. If anything, her body seemed to respond to sacred items with a peculiar stillness, as if absorbing their presence in silence. Her burns would sometimes fade during the prayers, only to reappear later in slightly altered forms. To some observers, this suggested a form of divine dialogue, her body as a message written in pain, shifting with intention. Simultaneously, scientific investigators began stepping away from the case. After exhaustive testing yielded no answers, and reputations began to fray under the weight of public curiosity, many physicians turned their attention elsewhere. Medical journals grew quieter on the subject, save for a few fringe publications that continued to explore her case in the context of psychosomatic and parapsychological frameworks. But as scientists withdrew, the spiritual community pressed in closer. Emma's diary entries during this period suggest a growing awareness of her role in the public imagination. She wrote of strangers kneeling outside her home, whispering prayers, leaving offerings of dried flowers and handwritten notes. Some treated her as a prophet, others as a cursed vessel. She never encouraged these beliefs, but noted the way people seemed to see in her something they had been waiting for, as though her suffering had unlocked a space for their fears and hopes to manifest. One particularly persistent visitor was Father Elias Brenner, a young Jesuit with a deep interest in mysticism. He spent several weeks in Bingen, conducting interviews with Emma and her family, reviewing medical notes, and meditating near her bedside during active episodes. He proposed a theory that Emma was a conduit, a human medium through which unarticulated divine energies expressed themselves physically. He believed her body might be a canvas for sacred language too primal to be understood consciously, and he suggested that the patterns on her skin could be interpreted through theological semiotics. Though his ideas were not adopted widely by the Church, his writings were preserved and later became foundational in certain fringe theological circles, seeking to bridge the gap between mysticism and corporeal suffering. In tandem with this religious attention came a wave of esoteric interest. Spiritualists, mesmerists, and early theosophists wrote articles linking Emma's symptoms to ancient texts and forgotten rituals. Some claim she was an etheric receiver, tuned to vibrational frequencies outside normal human perception. Her case was discussed in seances and cited in lectures by occult scholars who believed the veil between worlds was thinning in the modern era. A particularly controversial claim arose from a Berlin-based alchemist who insisted Emma's body had been altered by exposure to a celestial alignment at the moment of her birth, rendering her susceptible to energies from the moon and stars. He even attempted to draw astrological maps charting her symptoms against planetary motion. Though these ideas remain speculative and unprovable, despite the influx of theories, none of them scientific, spiritual, or otherwise, could prevent the slow progression of Emma's condition. Her skin continued to blister and burn, her body continued to overheat, and her symptoms remained resistant to both medical treatment and religious intervention. Photographs taken by a Swedish occultist during her final recorded episode show Emma lying calmly in bed, her arms patterned with faint spirals, her face serene despite the inflammation. These images would later be reprinted in numerous journals, both scholarly and spiritual, and remain some of the only surviving visual records of her condition. And then, in November of 1873, Emma vanished. Her family reported that she had gone to bed as usual, her condition relatively stable. But when they entered her room the next morning, she was gone. The bed was undisturbed, the doors locked from the inside. There were no signs of struggle or escape. Only her diary remained, open to a blank page, with a single pressed violet tucked between the pages. Investigations ensued.
Authorities
Searched the house, the surrounding fields, and the riverbanks, but found no trace of her. Her disappearance was recorded as unexplained. While theories ranged from elopement to abduction to divine ascension, no definitive conclusion was ever reached. For some, her vanishing was the final confirmation of her supernatural nature. For others, it was a tragic end to a life shaped and shattered by forces no one could understand in the years that followed. Emma's name became legend, her story, passed from journal entries to whispered stories to church sermons and occult treatises. Some claimed to see her in dreams, others believed she had been taken by angels or by beings even older. A few skeptics suggested the family had staged her disappearance to end the relentless attention, but no evidence was ever found. The medical files, the diaries, the photographs all were preserved, studied, and debated for decades. Emma became a symbol of the limits of knowledge, a cautionary tale for those who believed every mystery could be solved with scalpels and charts. Her body, so visibly marked by forces unknown, had resisted every attempt at explanation. It was no longer enough to be examined. She simply ceased to be present, leaving behind only fragments and theories, sacred texts, and half-finished case notes.